In a world overflowing with distractions, we seek meaning. How do we transform ambition into something deeper, into true fulfillment? I'm Sam Pepin, CEO of Walteric, and I've spent years helping businesses succeed by connecting their goals to something bigger. On the Meaningful podcast, we explore not just how to win in business, but how to grow as individuals. Through conversation with thought leaders, innovators, and everyday heroes, we uncover the stories that drive us towards something greater. Whether you're striving for success, seeking purpose, or just looking for the next steps in your journey, this podcast is your guide to navigating the intersection of ambition, growth, and meaning. So please join me and our incredible guests as we redefine what's possible in both business and life. Enjoy. Emotional intelligence is not a soft skill, it is the ultimate performance skill. Welcome to the Meaningful Podcasts. I'm your host, Sam Pepin. Today we're diving into emotional intelligence as a driver of peak performance, the evolution of leadership in high-stakes environments, and the future of workforce development. Our guest today is JD Walter, co-founder and president of Walteric LLC, a workforce learning and development company specializing at the intersection of emotional intelligence and performance. With more than 30 years of professional experience, including service in the U.S. Navy, work with the Department of Health and Human Services, and consulting across federal agencies, JD brings unmatched insights into how organization can unlock human potential. His mission today is to help leaders and teams build the human skills that fuels resistance, clarity, and long-term success. If you enjoyed this discussion, please let the world know with a like, a small review, or even a quick share. Your support helps more people find meaningful content just like this. Let's begin. Mr. JD Walter, welcome on the Meaningful Podcast. How are you doing?
Doing great, Sam. Thanks so much for having me today. I really appreciate getting a chance to talk to you and engage with your audience.
Absolutely. Well, we're very glad to have you, perhaps. And your journey has been one of quite peripety. So I'm looking forward to diving into them and making sense of them, perhaps. But to kick us off, please tell us more about Walteric.
Yeah, our company, Walteric, is we're a small learning and development company. So we focus on human skills development. They're also called power skills these days, right? Used to be called soft skills, but it's things like emotional intelligence, leadership, team building, strategic thinking, those sorts of things that complement the technical acumen, but really lead us to peak performance.
Interesting. Have you always bring us back a little bit to the very beginning of all of this. Have you always been fascinated by peak performance and how to optimize yourself and others?
The honest truth is that I started out, I was very non-human centric. I think, my time in the military, I started to see it. I really started to put the pieces together. How do people fit in organizations? But I think naturally I was just sort of had a strategic bend, and I was more interested in the structural components of organizations, like how do we organize work? How do we routinize certain tasks and activities? How do we build hierarchies? How do we infuse management into the process? What do the policies do? So I think I started very much from an administrative sciences kind of perspective, and that's where I've gone academically, all the way through my PhD. I study management and public management. But I had a few experiences along the way that informed kind of my shift to being more human centric. And then I had a couple like really big sort of moments where I was like, you know what, I've got this all wrong. This is not about the structure. This is not about this is about people. And so I just sort of reframed kind of how I approached work and kind of what I was doing. And then a few opportunities came along. But so no, the short answer to your question is no, I didn't start out with this perspective. I actually started on the exact opposite side, but came to realize that you can't solve certain structural problems because the structure is an abstraction, right? Companies, organizations, they exist on paper. We might have buildings, but they don't exist if we don't have people in them. And so, people are not just an asset. They're not a resource. They are ultimately the competitive advantage, but they're also the meat, right, of the organization. And so if you subordinate them in your priorities, if you think about people second, I think you're missing the opportunity to actually do something pretty crazy and fun and ultimately good, you know.
Sure. Yeah, and I want to talk about your foundations for leadership, because your perhaps your journey through not only obviously being in the Navy, but also going to obviously being a public servant also, then the PhD. You have a foundation, a background that very few people basically combines. I want to explore some of these roots, basically, if we may. When you're thinking about how did your experience perhaps in the navies and in public services shape not only your philosophy, like you said, sort of this movements from purely structure to people being the main asset of the organization, which I will wholeheartedly agree with you on, and perhaps in perhaps a philosophy on leadership, much more as a broader terms, basically, when it comes down to workforce, basically, and workplace development also.
Mm-hmm. So I've had great fortune to be around, and I think we can all probably say this, right? But I've had a great fortune to be around some of the best managers and individuals in my career. I've also been around some of the absolute worst, right?
Yeah.
So, so when I say I think we've all had an experience, I think we can all point to the best and the worst, right? Kind of in our experiences. And we live somewhere in this kind of center space between those two things because we're learning from both of those. We used to say early on, I'd rather work for a bad leader because I can figure out all the stuff not to do faster than if I work for a good leader, because you don't see all the things that you're not supposed to do because they're such a positive reflection on a day-to-day basis. But what I would say about the military in particular was I came to appreciate the necessity for hierarchy. I came to appreciate the need for divisions of labor, right? These are core to the human experience, right? As a primate, we've evolved. We are a social animal. Hierarchy, divisions of labor are always part of, we're very alpha centric, right? And we all have roles to play, and each of those roles is incredibly important. Quick anecdote, I was on a ship in the Navy at one point, and we didn't have a very big crew. I think we had about 180 people total on the ship. There was maybe 20 people in the wardroom. So the officer collection, the captain, executive officer, there was only about 20 of them. And I remember one day I was swabbing the deck like a good sailor does. And I was with a shipmate of mine, and they made a comment, and I don't know exactly how it was said, but the essence of it was, we can run this ship. We don't need them. And I said, you're right. We can drive this boat. We can fire rounds, right? We can navigate in and out of ports. We can do all the technical things that go along with driving a ship in the Navy. I said, but what we can't do is we can't call back to the group and have the admiral tell us what the strategy is. Like there's a plan in place, and we're not privy to that. That's not why we're here. We're here to run the ship. We're here to make sure the mains are functioning. We're here to make sure water's, potable water's available. We're here to make sure personnel records, are kept up to date. We're here to help navigate, but we're not here to make strategic decisions from an operational perspective. That's their job. They're trained for that. We're not trained for that. And I said, so they can't run the ship without us because they don't necessarily know how to drive it. They weren't taught how to drive it. We don't know how to be a part of an amphibious readiness group because we were a marine transport ship that I was on at the time. So we're part of an amphibious readiness group. That ARG, that ARG is part of a battle group. So the ARG has a commanding officer. So the ship has a commanding officer. The ARG has a commanding officer. The battle group has a commanding officer. And then we report back to fleet, right? So there's a fleet commanding. So there's a whole bunch of admirals and captains, but they have a specific language that they use, and they have a conversation going on that we're not privy to. So the reason I share that is because it was one of those moments where somebody said, well, why do we need them? And it made perfect sense to me in the moment. Well, we absolutely need them. There's a reason for this. And I think that helped me. So go back to leadership. Why is that important? The commanding officer of that ship was this wonderful individual. I got along with him great. I thought he was he was very empathetic, but he had all those great leadership qualities. But he could also be incredibly hard, right, on his crew, on his wardroom. But he had this way of interacting that was tailored to his audience, and you could watch him. You could see him on a daily basis. And it wasn't about being fake or, trying to, be popular or fun. Like he recognized that these two groups of individuals on his ship had two very different and very specific tasks. And he had to interact with them differently. It wasn't that he didn't care about his wardroom, but he would often... it would look like he could be very hard on his wardroom, where maybe it looked like he had more compassion for us enlisted. But it wasn't that he had more compassion. He had a different way of relating because what was being asked of us was different. And so I think that was probably one of those first experiences where it really made sense why leadership as a quality has to be situational, right? It depends on the moment. It depends on the audience, and it depends on what the responsibility of that group is, right? So it's not one size fits all. So I think that was probably the first thing that really kind of informed my approach.
It's very interesting when you talk about hierarchy. I think I sometimes feel that people have a hard time with this word or saying things like, I hate hierarchy and so on. I believe the way you explain them, though, is the way I see it. I went to this incredible conference, and it was basically a First Nation run business. And they were talking about this concept of circular hierarchy, where we still have a hierarchy from a conceptual standpoint. Like you said, there's still admiral, there's still people basically making the decisions, and there's basically a sense of hierarchy because, to be honest, biologically, and obviously as we study the brain with my company, it's a necessity. All right, we need most people need to be led to be effective, and that's just a point being flagged. But I think the way you describe it was very interesting because more and more with these basically hierarchy-centric, basically perhaps circular hierarchy-centric perhaps organizations, we see that instead of a very, I suppose, corporate feeling of one department being much more important than the rest, or at least feeling like it's more and more important than the rest, there's a recognition that everybody basically within that crew is necessary for their own task, like you said, this vision of labor, and therefore reinforced in an equitable fashions instead of sort of the ego war of just, well, I own a bigger title and therefore I make the decision, right. Don't talk to me, all right? And I'm sure you saw that a lot in Navy. I myself interact with a lot of people that have such a background because I just find it very interesting. I think it's very honorable, and I, first of all, thank you for your services also. Tell me more about the civil servant side. Was it similar? Did you perhaps accelerate on ideas that you already understood from the Navy? Were they very, very, very different and you like that? Tell me more about not only the transition, but how they intertwine.
Yeah, I came to a civil servant job sort of by happenstance. I had come back from Afghanistan, my last real sort of defense-focused contract with the government, and I started more traditional management consulting. And so I ended up, a friend of mine was at an agency and he wanted some assistance, and he knew I was good at strategy. And he's like, I'm struggling building out. He had a $40 million, sub agency. And he's like, I'm struggling with the budget here. Can you help me? And I said, yeah, sure. So I went up and I started working with them kind of on building out a strategy for this component of the organization. And that led to my meeting, of course, his boss. And then I did some work with her boss, who was the executive director of the agency that I was in. And that just led to a few, kind of consulting-like conversations that one of them came back and said, hey, would you like to join us? We could really use you and build out a full strategy. So we were a shared services organization. So a small group within the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services that focused solely on providing services to other components of the department and other agencies across the government. So things like financial management, payment services for grants. We did transportation, transit benefits, implemented a travel system, We did some supply chain. And we had a whole bunch of contract or acquisition support folks. So we were hovering around $1 billion in sort of throughput. Now, we were a completely unappropriated or non-appropriated agency, so we didn't get any money from Congress. The department had a working capital fund. We pulled our operating budget out of that, and then we contributed back to the working capital fund, and we had a very, very small amount of revenue that we could retain to continue to grow our projects. So it wasn't, I'm telling you this because it wasn't a traditional public service job where I was in a sort of citizen-facing program. It was very much behind the curtain. However, when I got there, it was, as you suggested, there were things about it that were very similar to the military. There was some element of rank orientation, right? I was hired in as a GS-15. That's the top of the GS level. Next step is a senior executive. But there were identities around these different levels of even being on the GS scale. What was the difference between a 13, a 14, and a 15? There were very strong perceptions about the individuals that sat in those particular pay grades. So there was a lot. So it wasn't a rank the way it is in the military, but there was very similar, I think, approaches to kind of where we were on the pay scale and really what that meant for the individuals that were there and what responsibilities they had. I think what I picked up more than the understanding that situational kind of component of leadership that I was talking about in the military, I think what I picked up on is that it really the experience part. How do individuals in the organization, how do they live their particular pay grade, their particular role, their particular place in the organization? And here we even used words like back office support. Nobody likes that term. I still use it, but now you want to say mission support, right? So you got mission centric and mission support. And so what I realized is that there was this real separation between the folks doing, the program work that goes off that, I'm managing the grant that is given to the state that then turns around and subsidizes mental health agencies at the local level. So that's somebody in a program or a mission centric role. Mission support is, your HR, your finance, guys like me, management consultant types, on the backside. So there was this very real distinction between those two things. And I think that did impact people's identities in the organizations. So on top of all these other things going on, where we had this sort of ways of kind of putting ourselves in boxes or putting others in boxes, we also had this big division between mission centric and mission support. All of these things sort of, like I said, they impact our identities and our experience on the job. But at some point they become detrimental because they're not useful distinctions, right? It's not meaningful to say to somebody, I'm a GS-15, you're a GS-14. Who cares, right? I get paid more than you. Maybe I have supervisory responsibility and you don't, but really what does that matter? Because you made a comment, all the work is important, right? You can't say that one thing is more important than the other. We want to, right? Naturally, yes. We want to say the quarterback's the most important position on the field. No, not necessarily. That's there's 11 folks out there, right? Like that, everybody's got to do their job. So it's the same thing at work, right? Everybody absolutely is necessary, right? Those roles are there for a reason. Now, sometimes we get a little overblown and bloated, and maybe we have some inefficiencies. And so we don't need every single billet. But yes, the function, the work that's being done is important. So if people don't get paid, they're not going to come to work. Grants aren't going to get let. Funds aren't going to flow down to the state. And people on the street that need mental health or substance abuse assistance aren't going to get it, right? So there is a very real trickle down effect. So it is important. You can't just dismiss somebody because what they do isn't sexy or it's behind the curtain or it seems mundane, right? And we have this, I think socially we have an orientation to the flashy, the glitzy, the sexy, the what gets on TV. And
Yes.
and we're not all that interested in talking about what goes on behind the curtain, but I mean, 90% of it goes on behind the curtain, right? Like the most of, and it's not more important, right? The front of the curtain is important just as. So I think what I took away from the public sector is really everybody, it reinforces everybody is critical, right? So
Yeah.
stop treating people differently, right? First of all, recognize everybody has their own experience. Everybody has um, uh, their own identity that is informed by that experience, and it can be positive or negative. And you can't treat everybody exactly the same. Now, you don't always have the opportunity to go deal with everybody one-on-one, but you do need to recognize that everybody is an individual and they have their own experience in that particular job based on all these conditions. And you have to be able to accommodate that in some way, right? And so that's the big challenge of this idea of leadership.
It's interesting you mentioned challenge. One of my favorite citations is from Robert Filick, and he said, strategy without process is little more than their wish list, and basically because they're so synergetic. I suppose outside of that challenge of sort of the not only the quality but the quantity also of the people, and the fact that again sometimes one-on-one engagement is not possible for a time perspective and others. But what would you say were the biggest challenges that not only you face when you try to improve strategic performance planning, but specifically across government institutions? The reason why I'm asking this question is, one, I'm very curious, but two, as we know, when you're talking about efficiency, government doesn't come to mind right away. Let's just put it this way. So,
Right.
tell me more about the challenges that
Yeah.
that was perhaps emerging from that.
Yes, you're absolutely correct. There is no association between government and efficiency, unfortunately.
Yeah.
There was a movement, probably started a couple decades ago, where there was this idea that you could run public agencies more like businesses. I think the spirit of the idea, was good. Yes, we can be a little bit more mindful, because I think what happened over time is we end up falling victim to bureaucracy. Now, I want to say this, and I want to be very, frank with everybody. Bureaucracy is not good nor bad. It is simply one way of managing highly complex, large, rules-based organizations, right? It is a management approach. It is, in and of itself, it is benign. Now, how we as humans exact bureaucracy, how we bring it to bear on a daily basis, that's where the trouble comes in. So red tape is commonly associated with bureaucracy, but red tape isn't a natural outcome of bureaucracy. It's an outcome of mismanagement within a bureaucratic system. So, and I've even taught some graduate level classes in public administration, and I always get this from students, right? Well, bureaucracy, bad, red tape. I'm like, hold on, understand these two things are different. One is this benign approach to running an organization, and one is a product of mismanagement. And not nefarious all the time. Sometimes it is, but not always. So efficiency in the government. So what I ran into when I first got to being a consultant, because I was consulting inside of that shared service organization. So I very quickly came to understand this idea of shared services, right? Centralizing activities to gain economies of scale to lower overall costs. And I thought, wow, this is amazing, right? Like, this is such a great idea, but nobody wanted to do it. And so, this conversation's been going on for, 10, 15 years. I mean,
Oh, for sure.
I started at HHS about 12 years ago as a contractor, and in those very early days, I started meeting the practitioners, folks from the Office of Management and Budget, folks from the Office of Personnel Management, senior leadership in the Department of Health and Human Services, other agency executives. And there was this conversation constant going on. We had provider groups and we had customer groups, and we would get together on a routine basis and we would talk. We would talk to the vendors that were providing the services, and we would talk to the agencies that were buying, and we'd talk to the agencies that were providers like us. And we were trying to find this way to kind of bring the conversation together so that we actually had enough energy to try and force this implementation across the government. Now, tons of executive orders have come out through the last several administrations, fostering this idea of shared services, but nothing mandated it. And so there continues to be massive amounts of redundancy within the federal government. So what I want to say about efficiency is this. So I think we assume the federal government is inefficient because there's this thing called red tape, because it's policy driven. So we've created something that is cumbersome. That is partly true. There is something to that, but I don't think that's the core of why governments ultimately are inefficient. I think it's because of the redundancy. And the redundancy comes from this desire for autonomy, this want to have control over all of the aspects of the operation. So if I'm an executive, let's say I'm leading, and I'll pick two agencies within the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, right? So let's say I'm running SAMHSA, that's the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Agency, right? The wonderful collection. These are some of there's such cool people inside this. I love working with them. I've had several contracts with them over time. And then I worked with them as a civil servant. And take another one, CDC, right? Centers for Disease, Center for Disease Control. And so CDC is massive, right? Like that's a huge organization, and it has a ton of money flowing through it from Congress for public health, disease prevention. SAMHSA is a much, much smaller organization in terms of employees. It gets a smaller budget. So, but what SAMHSA's orientation to is really about grants to the local level, right? So like I talked about, they run grant programs that fund the states that then flow that money down to the local level for these substance abuse and mental health programs. So if I'm running SAMHSA, what I really care about, I care about these grant programs, right? This is my number one priority. If I can't control the hiring process, I don't know if I'm going to get the right people. I don't know if I'm going to have the right lived experience. So something like an Office of Recovery, which is designed to foster recovery programs and is ultimately staffed with a whole bunch of people in different kinds of recovery, right? And that's incredibly important for that mission. So if I'm the administrator and I can't have control over how I hire those people, I don't want to go to shared services. I want to hold on. I want to white knuckle control of every aspect of my organization. Now, CDC, maybe there, I'm not so worried about the big scientists, the big brains that are coming in and talking about the future of disease prevention, from a public perspective. But I still don't want to let go, right? I have a big budget and I don't want to let that budget go. Right. Because that budget allows me, right, to do a large number of things that include research, development, and then programming. So it's really this. It's, locus of control. Nobody wants to give it away. Nobody wants to give up the ability to hire. They don't want to lose their budgets. They don't want to lose their authority when it comes to running contracts, et cetera, et cetera. So here what we have is this overwhelming case study that says, man, I could, if you want more money for grants, centralize all these activities and then let's repurpose that money, right? Let's repurpose that money for grant programs or disease prevention programs. But there's fear, right? Fear kicks in. I don't want to let go. There's a little bit of ego there, but I'm the administrator. I should have total control.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's just this resistance to it, And so this is where I think, so efficiency becomes very difficult because we don't want to give away control
Yes.
of some part of the process because we feel like if we let that go, the quality will end up dying at the end. So there's this misunderstanding, right? So this goes back to divisions of labor, right? We understand inside the organization, but ultimately, if you don't have that division of labor, and you have to think about that from a broader government perspective, right? The whole of government, that division of labor is incredibly important, right? Because letting contracts is critical. Paying people is critical, right? So, paying grantees is critical. So fear is causing this white knuckle reaction to the idea of collaboration and sharing. So the impediment to efficiency is our own ego and our own reluctance to step past our fears and say, no, this is the better way. I'm going to trust somebody else. I can still get this done, right?
Absolutely. And that brings us to perhaps the foundation of Walteric, right? Which, from my understanding, is really elevating human potential at scale, perhaps is how I would describe it from my research. I had this very interesting quote, which is, we started Walteric to solve the performance gap at its source, the human layer. I'm really, really interested to, I suppose, we talked a little bit about sort of a very, very extensive backgrounds there, but was there one driving problems that you aim basically to solve by funding Walteric? And yes or no on that, but I suppose, how does your model differs from traditional basically L&D model that we've been seeing for L&D firms, perhaps, that we've been seeing for decades and decades now? Tell me more about just the not only the natural angle in which you take to obviously be unique and be novel within this industry, but I suppose, what was it aimed at the very, very beginning of everything?
Sure. So let's, without pointing fingers and trying to make this a criticism of any particular people within an administration at any particular point in time, right? So we know that the Healthcare Act came out, right? And that required marketplaces, right? Healthcare marketplaces be delivered, right? And I think everybody that pays any attention to the government that knows that it was a total catastrophe, right? None of the marketplaces were ready on time. They didn't work well. So there was this, and it's because everybody was trying to build their own. Instead of saying, let's build one marketplace for everybody, right? They wanted to give the states their, ability to make their own, but it was such a mess, right? And so much money was wasted, so much time was wasted. And this is going to promo Salesforce, but excuse me, at the last minute, a platform was built on top of Salesforce. It was done cheap, it was done easy, and it actually worked. So all this time and energy is spent trying to build these and create these really cool from scratch things that ultimately cost way too much money, took too long, and didn't actually work the way they were supposed to. And then here's this platform that's off the shelf that has all this, native functionality. You just do a little bit of a configuration and bang, you've got what you need. So there, this kind of goes back. I'm relating this sort of back to that fear idea, that desire to control every aspect, and kind of, I think we lump legacy into, kind of our efforts far too often. Like, okay, this is my legacy. So what I'm getting at here is failure of large scale programs. So what I've observed, right? We implement a technology system. So I go out and I buy HR system number one, and I implement it enterprise wide inside of a cabinet level agency. Fast forward 5 years, we're only using 70% of the native functionality inside of that system. So number one, we're not getting our full return on investment. But number two, we've built 3 in-house systems that actually could be done by the enterprise system, right? Because we wanted more control. We thought there's one step in all of this that it can't do. And so instead of shifting the process or changing the rule, we say, no, we need a whole new piece of technology. There's some incredible statistics, but like, what is it? It's 70% of technology implementations fail. And by fail, they either are over budget, over time, or under deliver in terms of functionality. Well, why is that? Why? Technology is pretty decent, right? Like, but it's only as good as the people that build it.
Yes.
So we see technology programs failing miserably. And I used the healthcare marketplace as an example of that. But so what I observed were these large scale efforts that were not returning the investment that they ultimately should have. I did a little bit of work. I did these little tiny projects when I was at HHS, and we had 40 service lines, and I had a contract, and it only had a couple $100,000 on it. But I took the vendor and I said, hey, listen, I want to shift the focus a little bit. We made some tweaks. We modified the contract a little bit. And I said, what I really want you to focus on is processes. I want you to go to each one of my business lines, and I want you to sit down with them, their customers, and try and figure out if there's some way that we can improve it. Some small tweaks. I don't want to buy tech. I don't want to hire new people, right? I don't want to fundamentally change the approach, but I'm looking for small things that we can tweak to improve the customer experience and throughput, right? Can we do a little bit more for just a little bit less, and still, make our customers happy? I found that those things were very impactful. We found a lot of things that we could do. But in those efforts, the vendor that I was using was very mindful of the people part. So every time they said, okay, this is a change in a keystroke, that has to be consumed by the workers, right? They have to be able to take that change, internalize it, accept it, adapt to it, sometimes retrain to it in order for it to actually realize its potential as an efficiency change. So I think that's where I really started to get this idea that, we go off half-cocked to make changes to our organizations, public and private, to try and generate these efficiencies. And we think about people last. So take a common IT implementation. All right. So we go to the program owner and we say, what do you want? Well, I want X, Y, and Z. Pull in some engineers and some designers, and they concoct something. And then we go, oh yeah, that's it. And then they run up a pilot, and then the stakeholders get together and they're like, oh, this is awesome. I love it. Go forth and prosper and build. And the engineers and the designers, they go off and they build something. And then about 9 months later, somebody goes, oh, we need user acceptance testing. And the first time the users see the system is during UAT. And UATs don't go well. I don't know if you've ever done any large scale user acceptance testing of a software platform, but I haven't seen them go great yet. And I've set up a large scale service center for human resources, and we did readiness testing. So essentially a UAT of an operational center at the beginning, and it didn't go right. But the reason is the users, they're an afterthought. So I take this analogous to our consideration of the human experience inside of whatever this efficiency implementation is that we're doing. It doesn't matter if it's policy, process, or technology, if it's a structural component or reorg, those sorts of things. We wait to the last minute to get the impacted population into the mix instead of bringing them in the beginning and co-creating with them. Hey, what are you experiencing? What are you seeing? So this is what drives a lot of Walteric. If you don't consider the human aspect of whatever it is that you're doing in your organization, it's not going to net a return. You want to go buy technology? Great, go buy technology. You're not going to get your money back. You're going to blow 70, you're going to lose 30% right off the top because you're not going to implement it. Number one, because you don't know what you're buying. Number two, you're going to blow productivity for, however many months because you're going to put people at a disadvantage by suddenly changing the system on them. Oh yeah, you trained them on it. Yeah, we know what technology training looks like, right? It's never very good. And I'm not trying to dog people. It's just not because all it is, it's a keystroke activity, right? Okay, now click here, now click here. You have to build the human element into that training or it's not going to take, right? People are going to, it's a memorization activity. Well, I don't need to sit in training for that. You could have given me a help guide, right? But a help guide or a training doesn't tell me why this technology is necessary and what I'm going to get out of it as an individual actor within the organization if I adopt it, right? What am I going to come away with? So the benefit is always to the organization. Oh, we're going to save $100 million. Great. Am I getting a raise? Am I getting a bonus? What am I getting out of this? Do I get to go home an hour early every day? What is the advantage for me?
What's in there for me?
Yeah. So there's this problem where we don't talk about that. So on the one hand, I think about all the structural ways that you can solve for that problem. But then there's another aspect of it. And that is, are we actually ready for change as individual actors within any environment? And that is sorely lacking. So what we landed on at Walteric was this idea of resilience, capacity to deal with stress and change and still be productive. We think about peak performance as the capacity to accelerate through change, right? I'm not being slowed down, or I'm going faster through change. That's how resilient I am. That's how I've been able to look at all of these things called change, and I've been able to create a relationship with them as an individual and say, okay, this stuff isn't going to impact me, right? Like I'm going to continue to excel. But if I'm worried, right? Because every time you implement a piece of technology, is this my job? Right? It doesn't matter, right? You can say AI and somebody thinks I'm going to lose my job. Doesn't matter what it is. Like it's desktop automation and somebody's losing their job. And I say it kind of with a smirk and a little tongue in cheek, but it's real. We're looking at a world where we have come to depend on this thing called a job. We've built a lifestyle around the amount of money that we're able to make. We have responsibilities. We got families, kids, cars, dogs, houses, and we need to take care of all of that. So this isn't a job because, geez, I just love, processing, promotions for other people. This is a job because I have a lifestyle that I need to support.
Yeah.
And so there's a little bit of identity in the work that I'm doing, but there's a whole lot of identity in the ability to generate a revenue and turn around and take care of responsibilities. And so one little efficiency might look like I don't have a job. And if that fear kicks in, I'm going to resist, right?
100%. No, it's just the way it is, absolutely, from a biological standpoint and from a survival standpoint as well. I do want to, you talk about peak performance, and that's very much at the core of everything you're doing, right? You've been more than 30 years basically of practice at basically this understanding of not only what is peak performance, but how to achieve it perhaps. And you have quite a unique perspective that basically sort of blends neuroscience, emotional basically awareness, and also the practical system portion, which I'd love for you to dive deeper into for sure. I've always been sort of a very big fan of Ralph Marston. I don't know if you know him quite well, but he has basically this sort of more modern Aristotle, perhaps, and he says very often basically that excellence is not a skill. Basically, it's an attitude, right? Or as Aristotle would say, it's a habit. It's not a single act; it's an habit. I really want you to dive deeper into, from your perspective, being at this for so long and so effectively, what are the top basically internal factors that most consistently perhaps predicts sustainable high performance?
Resilience, number one, bar none. Emotional awareness. So recognizing what emotions are, recognizing that we have them, that they're real and we can't stop them, and we shouldn't try, because emotions, right, are built into us as a survival mechanism. As a species, our emotions are designed to keep us alive and to evolve. So, you think about fear as the most basic emotion, right? Well, why? Because fear kept us alive long enough, right? We didn't get eaten by tigers and we didn't get burned up in lava flows. So we're still here, right? So fear has served us as a species very, very well. It's what we do with emotions that we're really interested in. What behavior comes after the emotion? Now, we talk about like fear, fight, or flight, right?
Yes.
So fear. So there's really basically emotions are designed, in my perspective. This is non-scientific. So this is a very easy layman's way of thinking about it. Our emotions are designed for either two things, right? Protect us, fight or flight, or to engage in something that's beneficial to us. So I call that stay and play. Right? So we either have these emotions that are driving us to stay and play, like, oh my God, that's a beautiful, oh my God, this beach is so sandy. The sunset's beautiful. I want to stay here on the beach and hang out with my friends and drink cocktails, right? That's a very, very superficial kind of an analogy. But anyway, there's these things that are attractive to us, and that's where we want to stay and play. And then there's these things that are unattractive to us, and that's where we want to run away, fight or flight. Advance now to where we are in modern society, right? Society, which is a human creation, has quote unquote evolved, right, to a certain point. But our evolution of our social structure has outpaced our biological evolution, right? So we still have deep within us this emotion called fear. It's triggered by a lot of stuff because it's triggered by our perception of what's in the environment around us. So, is it a bear or is it, just bad traffic, right? The body doesn't know the difference. So intellectually, we have to rationalize this. So the ability to take that moment, right? I hit a trigger, fear, right? The amygdala fires, cortisol's released. I'm in an animated physiological state because I'm being prepared for movement. I'm preparing my body to take on an action. But in that moment, we tend to defer to, right, what the body's telling us, fight or flight, right? Am I going in fists ablazing or am I all in bucket? What we want to do is we want to get to a point of behavior where we're able to fairly quickly in the moment, take that trigger, recognize the stimulant, and then decide for ourselves what behavior is most appropriate in that moment. And so maybe it isn't fight or flight. Maybe it is, you know what? It's just traffic. Let me find a different song on the radio. And so we have to choose our behavior patterns based on that and not be reactive. So we talk about, do you want to be reactive to your emotions or do you want to be responsive to your behavior choices, right? So, so I think, so resilience, I keep saying this. So I talk about resilience is the ability to manage stress in the moment. And I call durability this ability or capacity to withstand the wear and tear of stress over time, right? So the buildup, right? Even minor amounts of stress, kind of build up over time, and they can lead to a point where we're like, I'm just losing it because, what they say, it's all the little things stack up. So to me, resilience, the ability to withstand the stress, an advanced emotional intelligence acumen, which is really about emotional reasoning in the moment and making deliberate behavior choices. This is the key to peak performance, right? Now, there's more competencies that have to come in. There's technical expertness. You do need some leadership capacity. You do know what collaboration is good for and why we need it. So team building and strategic thinking, right? But each of these competencies kind of come from a biological perspective, right?
Sure.
We are hierarchically based, so leadership is incredibly important to us to understand how to influence and lead a group of individuals, build cohesive teams, right? Understanding those divisions of labor. Why is it important? How do we treat everybody as equals, even though they're doing jobs that may be seen as more important versus, well, we don't really need that. No, I'm telling you, you can't just eat the protein if you don't have the gatherers. If you're not getting the roots and the berries, you're not going to be healthy. You're not going to survive. Both of those things, hunters and gatherers, are incredibly important to us. We need both of those things in our diet or we don't survive. So both of those jobs are equally important, even though we like to celebrate the hunter more than we do the farmer, right?
All right.
And then strategic thinking, of course, we have this wonderful capacity for abstract thought. What I believe is our competitive advantage as a species is collaboration, the ability to work together. In part, that is bounded by abstract thought. We have to be able to envision a future. We have to have the capacity to get people to buy into that vision of the future, leadership. And then we have to build the teams that are going to allow us to get there. We have to think about what do we need to do as a group to make that happen, and then we have these cool things called opposable thumbs, and we get to build spheres and stuff. And we have tools and technology that help us out. But this is sort of us at our biological core. And this is us in the modern world. And we've thrown the modern terms on it: leadership, team building, strategic thinking, emotional intelligence. But It's really the same basic thing.
It's interesting because you were mentioning the fact that perhaps the lack of the human-centered thoughts in learning systems is really to the detriment of its effectiveness. I'm really wondering, from obviously you perhaps elaborating on this topic, what are some of the key design elements that you find that are always key components of a successful, basically human-centered and perhaps resilient workforce learning system?
The first thing I would say is that everything we do is performance-based. That means there's some level of interactivity. I've done a lot of asynchronous learning. I've done a lot of asynchronous teaching. So there is value in information exchanges, right? There's knowledge transfer, right? Through some of those mechanisms. But when we start talking about behaviors, what do we do? What is the first thing we do as a baby, right? How do we learn behaviors? We do it through mimicry, right? The first way we learn to behave, to grab, to, square pegs, round hole, all that, it's a mimicking, right? What we're doing is we're looking at someone else and saying, is that the right way? Almost all species, the young learn this way. They follow the parents around, they mimic what the parents are doing, and they start to build a behavior. And that behavior then gets elaborated over time. So take wild cats. I have 2 cats. They're always on my mind. So take wild cats, right? Where the cub is following around its mother, watching its mother take down a gazelle. And then here's these little cubs, they start playing. But the playing is purposeful, right? That is them trying to figure out how to take down a gazelle. They don't really know it. They're just playing, but they're actually doing something that's going to allow them later to be able to perform as an adult cat and get dinner, right? So back to the humans, it's the same thing. We need to be interacting with human beings. If we want to talk about human skills, if we want to talk about human behaviors, the way to do it is in a room with other humans, not just having the conversation, but practicing the behaviors, role playing, getting in there and saying, no, that's wrong. No, that didn't work. Getting feedback from peers, not just me standing at the front of the room saying that's correct, that's incorrect, but getting an understanding of how the crowd reacts to certain things. Because this is what it is in an organization. If you're a manager and you're going to lead a team of 20 people, right? You need to know how your behavior impacts them. You need to understand that if you come in full of gas because there was a lot of traffic and you're going to take it out on them, well, they're going to respond in kind. They may not argue with you, but they're certainly not going to be very productive today. They're going to do a lot of shopping.
No,
You know what I mean?
Right. It's so interesting you talk about this mimicking. I love, babies dearly. I'm just perhaps a big portion of my life, and about most of my partners and clients, they have some type of families, and this mimicking faction is so important. When you smile at a baby, the baby smile back at you, just the way it is. It's very natural
Mhm.
for it to basically to do such thing. And I suppose when you're thinking about the mimicking, that also translates to culture. Right. One thing that you talk a lot about is the fact that there's no amount of planning perhaps that can compensate and subdivide perhaps for a toxic and misaligned culture. And Walteric seems to be addressing this in a way in which is very interesting. When you're thinking about obviously the synergetic importance of strategy and cultures, what role basically do you think that culture diagnostic basically plays in your consulting approach? And I suppose how do you how do you shift it, right? When culture is perhaps not only an emergence but is already setting up, what's the best way and most impactful way to perhaps gear the ship in a way that culture might be a bit more aligned with their objective?
Well, the first thing I'd say about culture is that you can have whatever you want on paper, but culture is just what people experience on a day-to-day basis. You can want it, but it's what people experience on a daily basis. So if everybody is animated and on their heels and in a resisted posture, then you've got a bad culture, right? You don't have a productive culture. You can have all the documents and you can have all the desires. So if we distill all this down, though, to human behavior, individual human behavior, right? Culture is just how are we all getting along? How are we all interacting with each other? Now, we know that we want positive cultures. We want collaborative cultures. We want cultures of learning, right? Because those things are advantageous to an organization. When everybody is in a learning posture, right? Accumulating new information, a couple different things are happening. You're keeping up with the times, right? You're always sort of on your toes and ready to innovate based on new emerging information. So something from the market comes in. A culture of learning is eagerly consuming that information and
Yes.
constantly thinking about the future, and they're innovating rapidly, right? And so it's very positive. However, you can't have a culture of learning if there's no learning opportunities, right? If you're not celebrating the very idea of development. So learning and development programs are one piece of developing people, right? The others are um, how do we reward? So we talk about this is interesting. So we talk about rewards and recognition all the time, and I've had so many conversations about this, and we always default to time off and money, and I'm like, nope, rewards and recognition. We got to move past gold stars. That's not where people are at. Recognition and a reward is more often an opportunity. Do I get to step outside of the bounds of what my job description says? Can I move up without being promoted? Can I take on a higher level of responsibility? Can I grow as an individual? Can I demonstrate to you as an organization that I have value to add beyond what I'm doing today? Can you envision a future where I've grown into the CEO role? Right? Is that possible? Is that what you want out of this organization? So we have to think about the way we develop individuals beyond learning and development programs. So training is incredibly important, right? But human skills, look, you got to be a technical expert. It goes without saying that you cannot achieve peak performance if you are not a technical expert, right? If you don't know how to do the job, you'll never do it at a peak level, no matter how great of a leader you are, no how awesome you are at building teams, and no matter how great of a strategic thinker you are.
Yeah.
If you don't know the work, you're not going to get there. So that kind of goes without saying, though I'm saying it, because I think in these environments, we default to technical acumen. Well, you're really good. Well, how do we pick managers? This one kills me, right? I think I feel so bad for managers almost more than anybody else in today's work world, because they're so grossly unprepared and so grossly ignored when it comes to the development, right? Think about the practice of management over time. How has it really evolved since Henry Ford, right? There's not a lot that really goes into the practice of management, right?
Right.
Then how do we get managers? Oh, we take technical experts. Geez, Sam, you're the best at this. Why don't you be a manager? Have fun. Wait a minute. Management is a very specific function with very specific tasks. That requires a technical acumen. So we take somebody who's a technician and we say, oh, go be a manager. Like you're just going to be magically good at taking care of people. When
Right. Because they're good at it
before. Yeah. So we promote poorly. And then there's this other thing. There's this, I hate this binary. Absolutely. This manager versus leader thing, the most uninformed binary that I think has been thrown around the management sphere over the last couple of decades, because it's damaging. Think about this. Managers dictate, leaders inspire. What does that just tell everybody who's in a manager role? You're the enemy. You're the bad guy. You don't know what you're doing. We've sent every manager on their heels by telling them that because they're a manager, they're not good enough. Oh, we need leaders. But guess what? Inside of an organizational structure, there's no job called leadership. There's no position within an organization that is this thing that we've devised that's leadership. There's management. Management is a practice. Leadership is the quality that you bring to bear on the activity, whether it's management or otherwise, because we know anybody, anywhere in an organization can exhibit the qualities of leadership at the very lowest levels, at the very highest levels. So managers are critical to organizations, right? Because they are the ones that have to translate all of that tactical information up so that strategic decisions can be made. They are the ones that have to decipher strategic decisions, translate them into tactical, operationalize those strategies so that tasks can actually be accomplished, right? Managers play a critical role in intelligence exchange in an organization. And in my opinion, they're probably the most devalued and underdeveloped segment of the employee population. And so go back to culture, right? So what's a tactic to fixing culture? The first step is to make sure your managers actually are ready to manage, right? Are they actually prepared? Tell me this. I love this one. You want to be a better manager? Practice empathy. What? I don't know what that is. You just practice empathy, right? Like, so we're not actually giving them any tips or tricks that are really meaningful. We've devolved to bumper sticker development, right? Be nicer. Yeah, great. All right. I don't know what that means, but okay, I'll try. So I think, from a cultural perspective, let's go back to this, more specifically, culture. The first thing, managers, right? Make sure your managers are ready to manage. Do they know the job of management? Do they understand how to take care of people? Do they have the vision that the organization is running off of? Do the executives share the strategic vision of the organization with the managers? They have to be trusted co-creators in that vision. And only then can they turn around and actually bring a group of individual contributors together into meaningful teams of collaborators to complete tasks and realize that vision. So that's the first thing. Start your managers. Obviously, it has to be modeled top down. Culture is about behavior, and behavior has to be modeled. So just like our parents, the CEO, the whole C-suite, you got to model the right behavior. Don't tell me I need to be empathetic if you're telling me, like, I don't care if your kid's sick, you're coming to work. These are discrepant ideas. This dissonance will cause me to step back. I'm going to be less productive simply because of that narrative. So managers first, senior executives to model it. But why do I say managers first? Because we know there's tons of data that show that people don't quit organizations, they quit their managers, right? There's some statistics I saw this. It's something like 70% of engagement, an employee's engagement, is based on their developmental opportunities, right? Am I being given an opportunity to grow? That's heavily dependent on how the manager structures the work. So workload distribution is often a common criticism. So I talk to a lot of organizations, a lot of individual contributors, and I say, what's your biggest problem? They're just like, overload, right? It's just like workload distribution doesn't make sense to us. I look over and I see Jack, and he's, coking and joking on the telephone. And I'm like going to be 12 hours into this today because I have so much on my plate. Why isn't Jack doing more? Well, Jack doesn't know how to do that. Why isn't Jack trained? Right? If Jack doesn't know how to do the job, why is he here? If it's a stretch opportunity, why isn't he being given it? Why aren't they being equally distributed across the individual contributors across the team? So managers are critical, I think, to building positive culture because we have relationships, right, with our managers. We don't necessarily have the relationship with the executives. We know them, we interact with them, sure, we like them, but we don't have that daily contact with them. So the manager becomes critical, but the leaders have to model that behavior, right? And then, of course, individual contributors need the resilience to deal with those changes, right? To deal with that. They're going to get criticized. I'm sorry. Constructive criticism is still criticism, and it hurts sometimes to be told that you were wrong or you didn't do it right. But how do you tell somebody like, hey, you made a mistake here, but it's not a failure and this is not punitive. I'm pointing it out so we can learn from this so that we can move forward and not do it again. That requires a certain kind of humanity and a certain kind of humility, and a certain kind of empathy that we're not just, you can't run down to the local market and pick it up in a box and stick it in your back pocket and say, look at me, I'm a leader, right? These are all things that have to be practiced. So, culture is driven, I think, very heavily by the middle band of management, the middle band of the organization, managers, because of the influence up and down. Executives probably are more likely to get on board with some of these ideas if they see the value in the managers. And of course, the individual contributors are going to jump on board because they have these relationships with their managers and they want to have that be productive.
Right. It's so interesting you mentioned this. It really reminds me of Mark Twain, which is the two most important day of your life is the first one that obviously you being born, but the second one being when you understand why. And it's very interesting because when you're talking to me about culture, for me, that's sort of the soul of work, right? The concept of work. And I suppose legacy and culture, those are all intertwined into this sorts of human-centric, perhaps, understanding. Tell me more about, is that when you're thinking about legacy and what you're trying to accomplish on a day-to-day basis, would you say that's basically what you're focusing on building now is perhaps this sort of understanding of human skill as an infrastructure, as a core component of not only business, but obviously just vital to quality of life and therefore flourishment? Would that be fair to say?
I think absolutely. Just one note on legacy. I'm pretty adamant about this. And
Okay.
so I say it because I think it's important. We get wrapped up in legacy in terms of our identity inside of that. I have a very different perspective. I think legacy is the thing that you're not remembered for. It's the things you're not recognized. If it's truly impactful, you're lost in the shuffle, and that's okay. So it's kind of like being a parent, right? Look, I know my son's always going to love me, but he doesn't need me. I'm not that guy anymore, right? I remember distinctly the day that I realized that's not my little buddy anymore. He's still this person that is incredibly important to me. I love him dearly. I'm incredibly proud of him, and I'm always going to be there for him. But he doesn't need me anymore, right?
Yes.
And it was the moment that I watched him bouncing his own baby on his knee, and I was like, crap, he's got a much better handle on being a parent than I ever did at his age, right? Because I had him about the same time. So when I think about legacy, I think about my son, right?
Yes.
And I'm not going to be remembered. And then eventually he's not going to be remembered. And then my grandson, and then a great grand, and it keeps going. So I think there's this thing about legacy. We love to talk about it, but I think about it not in terms of how am I remembered. I'm thinking about it in terms of what impact comes from it, right? What can be left behind that you don't have to remember me, right? That's the best kind of legacy. I think if our legacy is tied to us as an identity, then it's probably not really all that cool or all that.
Yeah, no, it's interesting.
Right.
You don't want to know something? I heard this from Kanye West of all people, which had the opinion you have on him is fine. But he said something, somebody asked him about the concept of legacy, and he said, I hope to be forgotten. And he said, and then the interviewer said, no, why? What do you mean by that? He's a very eccentric guy, obviously. And he said, well, because most things that made biggest impact in the world are ubiquitous, right? You don't, most thing that you go to and perhaps that you prosper with, you don't know the inventor of such thing. It became such a necessity that the tangible perhaps realization, the creation was more important than its creator. And I think that's a very interesting way to look at it. And I really love this sort of a perspective you have on that. To conclude, obviously, Joey, we really love to tell me, where do you see the future of public services, perhaps? How do you think we can improve it? And perhaps where do you think all these conversations we've been having and sort of this adamant and maybe even this trend, quote unquote, of thinking more of a human-centric way will be leading us?
Well, I think so. Public administration is an activity. Obviously it's necessary, right? We have to have governments, but governments are come together, because the people have decided there needs to be this central management of something. Okay, fine. And there's the romantic version of what a government is. We can go back and we can, incite the spirit of the founding fathers and all this other stuff. But what I really think about is that, look, we do come together. So there has to be some level of consensus on what a government is supposed to be. And I think this is where we've strayed. And this is not a criticism of any one particular politician or any one particular administration. I think we kind of blew it right from the start, right? I don't think Washington got it right. So I think we've kind of missed the mark throughout our entire history. And that is the government. This goes right back to legacy, right? The government is front and center, and it is full of identities and egos and arrogance and desires and power grabs and fill in the blank. Government doesn't really exist. This is cynical. Government doesn't really exist to take care of the people because nobody really cares what we say. Nobody asks us what our opinion is. Well, we do voting every now and then, but that is very, very superficial, right?
Okay.
So, unfortunately, what's happened in our country particularly is there's this commoditization of politics. And now it's being bought and sold. It's not about serving us. So the first thing I would say about government in general is that, the people should try and reclaim the power because it's ours, right? In this country, nobody's more powerful than us as citizens. And I believe that anywhere, like any country, any government should be created solely for the purpose of taking care of the citizens. But why don't we take that control? Because we're so easily manipulated. We're so easily exploited, right? Our whole world is this barrage of stuff being thrown at us, and all of it is designed to get us to think a certain way. It doesn't matter if it's a car commercial. Oh, you want to be cool? Drive my car. You want to be healthy? Drink my milk. You want to be fill in the blank. So everything is designed to play on some sort of, feeling of inadequacy that we may have, some gap in what we believe is our best self. And it goes off, to the most catastrophic, end of the spectrum where we're recruiting, marginalized students into, terrorist organizations or gangs or something like that. But the spectrum is the spectrum. They all recruit the same. It's the same psychology being used across the board. So what do I think? I think if we as a society or as a collective or as a species decide to be more resilient and we build that capacity within ourselves to withstand the stress and the criticism, if we can handle being vulnerable and building really trusted relationships and not being so exploitable and co-opted into everybody else's stuff along the way, I think we're in a much better position to care about the things that are really worth caring about, and then moving past all the other noise that's out there. Because I think 99% of it is noise. It's chatter for chatter. It's chaos for chaos. It's just somebody telling me what they think. I don't care. I just don't care what you think about this. Your job isn't to tell me what you think. Your job as an elected official is to do what I freaking told you. Right? Mm-hmm. But you never asked me, so you can't ever be successful. So we've got this break, I think. Okay. But the future of public administration, which is different than politics, that is the management of the government. I do think we need to rein it in. I do think we have too big of a workforce at the federal level. I think too many things are being taken on by the government that should be done at the local level. As citizens, we experience our citizenship at home, in our towns, in our cul-de-sacs, going to the local gas station. States and nations, those are abstractions, right? Like you can't reach out and touch that. I can drive by a building, right? I can go to a town where supposedly the head of government lives, and I can look at buildings where supposedly government activities occur. But again, government is this abstraction. So I don't experience it as a citizen, except for at the local level. So what I hope is the future of public administration is that we do rein in the federal, right? We get it more efficient, and we recognize that there is so much more that should be done at the local level, but that has to come with autonomy. Local communities have to be able to decide for themselves what they want based on the constituents, not based on some, pie in the sky kind of an idea. So I think there will be, obviously there's a push right now. I think we do need to reduce the total number of federal employees, not because they're bad, not because they don't perform. They're wonderful people, all of them. I love all of the public servants that I've met, but there's just too many of us. Because there's too many rules. So we need to go through the rule book and kind of pull some stuff out, start throwing some things away. We need to bring the government down. We need to share. Every agency within the government has its own HR shop, has its own finance shop, has its own contract shop. Why? It's one organization. It only needs one. So centralize all of those back office functions. The economies of scale that will be generated will far and away exceed the hopes of efficiency of the current administration. Mm-hmm. What's being talked about now are nickels and dimes. Look how much money we saved. Ain't saved anything yet. It's a joke to throw a $65 million number out there when the budget is as big as it is. You know what I mean?
Yes.
What does the Department of Defense get? $500 million? CMS gets $600 million, or gets more than that now.
More, yes.
This little bit of savings is nothingness. The contracts that are being canceled are minor, right? $600,000, $700,000, $800,000 contracts. There's a few bigger ones in there. So it's not wrong. It's just misguided. You're never going to find the kind of savings that ultimately needs to be found. So absolutely find the savings. I agree with that, but go after it the right way. Right now, it looks like a witch hunt, and that's what everybody says. So it's open to criticism because there's too much political baggage for every decision being made. But you can buffer from that and say, look, we have X hundreds of HR shops in the federal government, and we're going to consolidate those. OPM, you are now the HR office for 1 million employees. Get cracking. Now, obviously, their HR staff is going to increase probably tenfold from what it is now, but it's going to be a massive savings across the government. And the realization of those savings, I think now we're in a position to have a conversation about the politics. Okay, now that we've got administrative efficiency, now let's talk about all the other ways that we spend money as a government, but divorce those two things. Don't lump them together, right? Foreign aid is that's a political decision. That's a legislative act to grant foreign aid, right? But I don't want to talk about that because I don't have an opinion on it. From an administrative perspective, I have an opinion on efficiency. So if we can get efficient, I think it's much easier then to have the political conversations, right? Because it's not buried in all this other junk, right? Like we've cleaned it up. We've said, okay, now we got an efficient engine. Now, we want to run it to what end, right? Are we entering the 24 hours of Le Mans? Or are we going to do an hour and a half race on this circle track, right? Like, what are we trying to accomplish here?
Right. It's very hard to hit a target when you don't know what it is. I think that's I think that's bottom line. And you want to know something? I was not expecting such an intricate and detailed answer, but I really appreciated. And GD Walter. I mean, it's been such a pleasure to exchange with you on numerous topics from Navy to public servant to L&D and coming back in circle perhaps. But I really thank you for being on the Info Podcast, and I would love if you could share some last words of wisdom with our audience, please.
I think for me, it's all about intentionality. This is kind of, I used to say that deference was the thing that we lacked most as a society, right? Okay. Recognizing deference kind of plays off of this idea of liberty. Liberty is actually, it's an obligation. It comes with an obligation, and that is to actually constrain your liberty out of deference for those around you. But I think today I would say intentionality. We need to be much more deliberate, but that means we need to be much more informed. To get more informed, we need to be much more resilient because we need to be able to think for ourselves. We can't be getting co-opted into everybody else's argument. So if we build resilience through our emotional intelligence acumen, we will be able to distill and discern these flows of information in a much more productive way where we can say, yes, that is a truth. And now I feel this way about that. This is my position, rather than just being tugged along into all the arguments that are being had. I worry because I think being right it's way too celebrated. I don't really care about being right. Like, that's not of concern to me. But my rightness in today's society is based on your wrongness. All I have to do is discredit Sam and I'm suddenly right. It's not about evidence-based argumentation. We don't have debates. So I think if we could get back to some level of intentionality, and we recognize that to be intentional, we need to be resilient. We need to be thoughtful. But that gives us the capacity then, I think, to filter through this constant barrage of information and just stuff that's coming at us, and really decide what is most relevant and then make decisions based on that versus just knee-jerk reactions to headlines. You know what I mean? And so, from a company perspective, what I would say is that if I can go somewhere and help 1, 2, 3 employees recognize what resilience can do for them on the job, they will naturally go off into their life with this new competency, this new capacity, and it will fundamentally change their existence. And so that's all we're trying to get to. It's like, if I can get people motivated to see it, and if we can help them develop it, then we actually can have a pretty substantive impact on the way the world works. Now, I'm not out here trying to advocate like I want to change the world. That's not my job. I just want to advocate for a behavior, an approach to our own behavior that's much more beneficial to us. And it has this trickle down effect.
It actually makes the world a better place.
Thank you for spending your time with us today on the Meaningful Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave a review or share it with someone who could benefit from it. And always remember, your story matters. Make it meaningful. We hope to see you next time.